Countdown to Eternity starts now.
Well, hello, my dear brothers and sisters. I want to welcome you to another episode of Countdown to Eternity. And as you can see, if you're not listening on the radio, I am with the great Andy Woods. He is a dear friend of mine, the pastor of Sugarland Bible Fellowship. What a great opportunity to talk about something spectacular, bro. First of all, let's start with this. How are you doing out there in Texas?
Well, we're doing good. The weather is going to change soon from summer to fall, so that makes us all happy.
Yeah.
And Texas is doing great. It's a privilege to live here.
Bro, I was in Dallas just last week, and it was unbelievable. We have hit over here in California, we have hit 110 degrees in some areas in Southern California, and it did not feel as bad as 85 degrees in Dallas with 90% humidity. What in the world?
Yeah.
That's not fun, by the way.
Yeah. Well, as a transplant from, I grew up where you are, Southern California, to Texas was kind of a shock weather-wise, and then the vocabulary is different. I had to learn the difference between y'all and all y'all.
Yeah,
Two different things.
That's true. It's very, very true. Well, listen, we have a lot to talk about. There are things that are happening right now in the Middle East that are absolutely astounding. Let me just start with the simple statement, because this is going to make some more sense, and it's going to bring us to the subject of Babylon. It's going to bring us to the issue of Iraq and what's happening there and some of the things that are taking place in the Persian Gulf. But let me just start with Saudi Arabia. Of course, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion regarding OPEC and what's happening or what's beginning to be ensued with BRICS. And one of the conversations that a lot of people have been having is what everybody refers to as the petrodollar. And I think there's a lot of fundamental misappropriation of the facts related to the petrodollar that are oftentimes being communicated, even by so-called financial experts. Let me just bring up this one aspect that's pertinent to the conversation, and I'm going to open it up for commentary to you because we need to get a little bit of background before we enter into this aspect of it. So let me just simply say that when we talk about the petrodollar, the real value of what people term the petrodollar is something that is completely unrelated to what most people think. You see, people think that when we talk about the petrodollar, we're referring to United States currency as being the only currency that is accepted or valued in terms of what is used to purchase oil reserves or what's used to purchase any kind of energy from OPEC. The problem is it has nothing to do with that. As a matter of fact, the phrase petrodollar really does relate more to facilitating Saudi Arabia to be able to purchase U.S. Treasury bonds when it's technically illegal to sell to them. So the idea here is it's kind of Saudi Arabia's way of being able to buy these interests, in essence, purchase a lot of debt that the United States has. And of course, that has gone very well over the years. As a matter of fact, when we got to the beginning of January, we saw as much as $140 billion worth of treasury bonds being held by Saudi Arabia until Saudi Arabia began to see a weakening not only of the dollar, but until they began to see a weakening of the economy that surrounds the dollar, which is why they have been selling off treasury notes like you won't even believe. And that is where we talk about the abandonment of the petrodollar and this renewal that's coming up with OPEC to make changes. Now, all of this to say, Saudi Arabia is recognizing the need that they have to diversify their sources of income, understanding that energy is not going to be the only thing that's going to sustain them. This is why they've got this Noun project. This is why we're dealing with so many of the other things that we're seeing them do with respect to even Olympic Games, athlete events, boxing. They're diversifying in a substantial way, and perhaps the most significant aspect of all of this diversification is creating a trade system that is unlike anything that's ever been seen in the region. There have been talks about building bridges over a portion of the Red Sea. The Saudi Arabians have already entered into discussions with the Egyptians in terms of subsidizing the Egyptians for bypassing the Suez Canal. We're actually looking at a series of land bridge discussions for new trade routes that are beginning to exist in the Arabian Peninsula, and especially the portion of the Arabian Peninsula that relates directly to nations, of course, east of that, especially when we start thinking about Pakistan and India, and we start talking about all of these nations that border the Arabian Sea. Even Iran is part of this discussion, and what becomes even more significant is Kuwait and, of course, Baghdad, or Kuwait and Iraq. I'm thinking in terms of the capitals. And I think that what's really astounding here is Saudi Arabia's move to change all of this centers around one critical component, and that's this: southern Iraq. Southern Iraq calculates into Babylon. And if everything happens the way I think it's going to happen, especially understanding the biblical precedent for those things taking place, this new city of Babylon is going to become something far more significant than anybody really realizes, and it's going to match up directly with the things that we read about in Bible prophecy. So with that long discussion or that long introduction, I want you to just cut loose on this. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about what the Bible says concerning that, and then maybe we could talk about how all of this is forming and why it's so significant.
Well, the first issue, Saudi Arabia, let's talk about that first. I mean, we believe Saudi Arabia is mentioned in Bible prophecy. I mean, it's right 100%. There. It's right there in Ezekiel 38. I think it's verse 13. You know, Sheba and Dedan. When this invasion that we talk about frequently, Ezekiel 38 and 39 happens, spearheaded by Russia, Turkey, and Iran. When that invasion happens, the Saudis aren't going to like it. And they're going to stage what we would consider to be kind of a lame protest. They don't seem to do anything to really stop the invasion, but they speak up. And that's kind of odd when you think about it, because Saudi Arabia is a Sunni Islamic country, and so why wouldn't they applaud the invasion? And I think the answer partly relates to the things you're dealing with here. All of these kind of trade agreements that the Saudis are entering into. Probably the next thing that's going to happen, I saw something in the newspaper where Blinken said this could happen before the election. So this is imminent, is the normalization agreement between Saudi Arabia and Israel in what are commonly called the Abraham Accords. I mean, all the analysts say the Saudis are the next to fall under the jurisdiction of the Abraham Accords. And the Abraham Accords, is important to understand, just for the benefit of your listeners, are not peace agreements. They're normalization agreements.
That's
where
right.
Israel opens up to any nation that will acknowledge Israel's place on the map, which Islamic countries haven't done in the past. We'll open up what I call the 4 T's: trade, tourism, travel, technology. And so as that opens up, all of a sudden you have an explanation in place as to why the Saudis would speak up and be against this invasion spoken of in Ezekiel 38 and 39. So big picture stuff, that's what comes to my mind as you're talking about the Saudis branching out economically and involving themselves in all of these different things that you've been discussing. And then the second thing you brought up is Babylon. Apparently there's a connection between Saudi Arabia's wealth, and Babylon. Well,
oh yeah. Hello,
that fits that fits Revelation 17 and 18 very, very well.
Yep.
If you want to take the text at face value, which the two of us do, not everybody does on this, but we take Babylon to be Babylon.
Yes.
So
100%.
there's no need to pull out my magic markers and cross out the word Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18 and write in Rome or the United States or something crazy like that. So if Babylon means Babylon, Babylon is destined to enjoy a major resurgence in the end times. And so this movement of the Saudis, helping Babylon rebuild economically, that would set the stage for what, is anticipated in Revelation 17 and 18. So that's kind of big picture stuff. You went into a lot of different intricacies, but that's where I see all of these intricacies that you were talking about contributing to the big picture of God's prophetic plan for the ages.
And I think it's very interesting because we're already looking at a very clearly defined division between northern Iraq and southern Iraq. And what's really interesting is the dynamics that exist between that division geopolitically appear to be feeding into what will be the final product of these types of disagreements, especially when you start considering movements of the Kurds and how that also relates to United States involvement, which seems to be diminishing as a result of the weakening position of the United States. It's also very interesting to see how an abandonment from the Pacific is changing the mindset of China and how it's dealing with things going on with Taiwan. Of course, we don't even have to get into the intricacies of Hong Kong and how that begins to affect everything. But I mentioned those things. I mentioned those nations because that dramatically affects how we begin to see unfolding dynamics in the Middle East. And the Middle East is beginning to run with a few things that they had never run with before as a result of understanding the necessity to do so, otherwise, if not, going away. And remember, you look at MBS's recent interview with Brett Baer, and there's been a few since then as well. We're talking about the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. When you look at some of the things that he said, he's made it very, very clear. He says, my aim is G7. I want to be a part of G7. G20 for me is not enough. And we as a kingdom should be able to achieve that much faster than anybody else because of the vast resources that we have and the willingness that we desire to show with the world around us to be able to facilitate mutually beneficial relationships, particularly within the establishment of new trade routes and sources of income that generally will be understood to be perpetual in nature as well as mutually beneficial. And that's something that Saudi Arabia is making a big deal of. Their whole goal, as a matter of fact, they're even willing to, in some respects, willing to work with people in Yemen who are more sympathetic with the universalist cause as opposed to the type of things that right now are happening with the Yemeni Houthis. So this is very interesting. And even Iran is raising an eyebrow or two, open to the type of, let's just say, moderately diplomatic relationship that they're trying to establish a little bit closer now with Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia is like, look, we're going to be close to our friends, but we're going to be even closer to our enemies. We're going to hold them a little bit closer. So they don't trust they don't trust Iran as far as they can spit. I think Saudi Arabia, Iran feels the same way. But we're watching an agreement that's being formed between them. And by the way, the last time that discussion was facilitated, the facilitator of that discussion was in Iraq. So a lot of people think that this initial agreement that existed between China and Saudi Arabia was a function of some kind of a secret arm of the United States of America. No, it was actually put together by Iraq. Now, that is not a coincidence. I don't think that that's something that we should look at and just go, oh, that's just, weird. It's perfect geography, considering. But it's perfect geography for a much more substantial reason. And I think that we really are looking at the formation of a modern-day Babylon.
Yeah, and, years ago, I was reading a commentary by a really well-known creationist, Dr. Henry Morris, and he said way back in the 80s, early 80s, in his Revelation commentary, a world capital in Babylon is the perfect place in terms of its location, in terms of oil reserves. And so he said, look, I'm not a prophet nor the son of a prophet. I'm just a literal Bible reader, but I completely anticipate that in the end times, the city of Babylon is going to come back to worldwide significance. And a lot of people, when we articulate this, they kind of mock us like,
oh, yeah.
Oh, nothing's going on there. It's just a tourist trap. It's not a worldwide capital. Well, let's look at it from this angle. The only thing that city needs is the Antichrist.
Yes.
Washington, D.C. is not our biggest city, but it's our most important city because that's where our top political people, reside and do their work. All the Antichrist has to do is go set up shop there. And that city, just like that, will move into worldwide significance. And there are things happening in our world, things that you're talking about. We could talk about a land oil route, other things that are going to contribute to Babylon's wealth in the last days. But even if we take all those things off the table, the only thing that's necessary is the Antichrist to show up there and claim that place as his
Yeah.
world capital. And just like that, an insignificant city, regardless of how small it is going to be propelled to worldwide significance. So, God means what he says and says what he means. People used to laugh at people that said, "Oh, Israel can't become a nation again." I mean, how ridiculous is that? And look who's being vindicated. It's
Oh
it's
yeah.
it's people that took God at his word. What we're suggesting is the same thing is about to happen concerning the city of Babylon.
Yeah, I would agree. And there's so many other abstract thoughts that I continue to have regarding this very issue. Like, here's something that I just have obsessed over, especially recently, as I've been considering what could be the future geopolitical infrastructure that surrounds Israel in the time of the final Antichrist's life being lived out. And I think about it in context of the first four seals in Revelation chapter 6, and recognizing the model of totalitarianism that develops, which brings us into war, which of course brings us into economic failure, which brings us into death, when you're talking about the white, the red, the black, and the pale horse respectively. But what really like kind of captures me, it sort of hypnotizes me a little bit, is the more and more and more and more I begin to think about the dynamic happening in Jerusalem, the more and more I begin to meditate on passages like Zechariah chapter 12, when you start looking at the first 3 verses of Zechariah 12, where it talks about Jerusalem being a literal cup of drunkenness. It becomes the very tool that causes all of the nations to become so inebriated that their ability to be able to interpret the same data sets that we're all looking at is compromised. They treat everybody differently, everybody the same, but when it comes to Jerusalem, there's just something that causes them to be just completely drunk out of their brain. What happens if the final Antichrist, even with his demand to be worshiped, as we read about in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, what if the Antichrist recognizes Jerusalem is way, way too hostile of a place for me to set up my headquarters? I understand where it is, and maybe part of this peace treaty that he exists, this strengthening of a peace treaty that's established at the commencement of the tribulation. What if that involves an actual territorial change, which brings an element of neutrality to Jerusalem with respect to any type of governmental ruling, which would necessitate the creation of a city like Babylon? I mean, I've always just thought about that, and it would make sense, because when you think about the insanity that's associated with the Antichrist going back into the temple and demanding to be worshiped, the one thing that always captures my mind and my heart about this is, when he goes into the temple and he demands to be worshiped, how is it that people are going to line up to do it? How is it that people are going to want to take the mark of the beast? We see it. It gets to the point in Revelation 14 where an angel has to show up and say, don't take the mark or you're going to die. You're going to be thrown in the lake of fire. Don't do this. And yet it would appear they continue to do it. Perhaps it's associated with an undying sense of loyalty that exists with this totalitarian ruler that people don't even recognize as totalitarian because of the favorability that he has, whose new headquarters is now in Babylon, and positioning himself in the temple in Jerusalem would only be a sort of a variable symbolic act that would create the kind of condition that most people would nominalize. I think that it could be something related to that. I don't know. There's a lot of assumption being made here. Like I'm throwing a lot out, but it would seem as though the need for neutrality in that region, as even being emphasized right now by Saudi Arabia, would be one of the driving variables that cause Babylon to emerge the way we think it's going to emerge based on what the Bible tells us.
Yeah, I mean that's one potential scenario. I mean, what's interesting is God really doesn't tell us which scenario
Yes,
through
that's
which
right.
it's going to happen. We just
That's right.
know it's going to happen. It's like dealing. You mentioned the temple. It's like dealing with the temple that has to be desecrated midway through the tribulation. Well, that implies that demands actually that temple number 3 is built. Now we don't know
Yep.
how, when, under what circumstances. People ask me, is it going to happen before the rapture, after the rapture? My answer is, I don't know. I just know it's got to be up and functioning midway through the tribulation period. So in the same way, these two cities that you're talking about, Jerusalem and Babylon, and by the way, track those two cities through the Bible, you'll see they're interacting with each other constantly.
100%.
I mean, you could actually call the Bible the tale of two cities. It's tracing Babylon, which started in Genesis 11, and Jerusalem, which I think is first referenced in Genesis 14. They're two independent cities, and they're traced all the way through the Bible. In fact, it was in Babylon that the nation of Israel went east 350 miles and was in captivity for 70 years. But you can just track those two cities all the way through Scripture right into the end times. And I know that two of them play a major role. Babylon plays a role, and then the city of Jerusalem plays a role. You quoted earlier Zechariah 12, the nations against Israel and Jerusalem. And even the Antichrist, towards the end of Daniel 11, he pitches his tent between the seas somehow. That would be the seas, Mediterranean versus, I think, the Dead Sea. Somewhere in between, he pitches his tent. Well, that's where Jerusalem, resides. And so it's just a fascinating thing to see God highlighting, accentuating these two cities, and then to talk about these different scenarios in terms of their resurgence. We don't know which path God is going to take, but we know those two cities are destined to play a major role in his program.
It's actually a brilliant observation. It's interesting because you have articulated it in a way that makes it very tangible to people. There is an undeniable corollary relationship that exists between the two. And it's interesting because one appears to be very fictitious. One appears to be in nature defined satanically, while the other happens to be a very God-ordained situation. And when you examine it as early as Melchizedek and his appearance in the Bible's description of him, which is what you're referencing, it really makes for a remarkable study. I mean, there's so much to think about in that vein. And it's not a coincidence that we would see the appearance of Melchizedek so quickly after we see the story of the Tower of Babel and what ended up happening there. So that correlation is pretty remarkable. And you're right. We don't know exactly what's going to happen, but beginning to make those associations become very, very extremely important. Extreme too, I guess. But it's such an important aspect of what we're facing. And with the rise of Babel all over again, we begin to see the need to understand the corollary relationship that it has with Jerusalem, which, by the way, it's interesting. As Jerusalem begins to grow in prominence in the days in which we live, the direct emphasis would appear to be the relationship that we have with God in conjunction with the things that you see in that city. Whereas Babylon is beginning to grow, and the discussion of Babylon, you're actually beginning to see the rise of what is Antichrist, or instead of Christ. You're beginning to see the rise of the modern day Babel, Tower of Babel, which is, I think part of that is AI. You're seeing a lot of stuff that are designed to replace the very existence of God at a corporate level, which would make the validity of these cities standing with one another at a completely different, have a completely different significance. And it will create the economy of the end times like we've never even seen or known before. I think it's really remarkable. I think it's a great observation, by the way. Like, it's very engaging to think about. And I think that the correlation is becoming more prominent now. And isn't it funny, as you begin to see the prominence of Jerusalem being discussed more and more and more and more and more in this day, we're also seeing a more prominent discussion that centers around southern Iraq. It's not a correlation that should be denied or looked at nominally.
Yeah, in fact, I when I taught through Revelation, I know you taught through the book of Revelation at your church recently. When I got to Revelation 16, verse 19, which I understand as two different cities.
Yeah, oh yeah.
In that verse, destroyed in the final bowl judgment. I did a sermon called A Tale of, borrowing from the classic work, A Tale of Two Cities. And just tried to explain to the people that these two cities, I mean, they owe their history and origin to the very first book of the Bible.
Yep.
and just track them through. God has an interesting program and plan for both, and they're constantly interacting with each other. And if that's true, and Jerusalem is literal, a person has to, adopt a dual hermeneutic or an
Oh
allegorical
yeah.
hermeneutic to suddenly allegorize, Babylon. And in fact, in my dissertation at Dallas Theological Seminary, I was trying to debunk preterism. The preterists basically believe that Babylon in Revelation 17 and 18 is the city of Jerusalem,
Ugh.
which I think is crazy. But one of the arguments I use to sort of debunk that is the two cities are always kept separate and distinct all the way through the Bible.
Yes.
Why would the book of Revelation, which is just summarizing Old
Yep.
Testament prophecy, suddenly merge the two cities? So keeping those two cities in mind really keeping them distinct, keeps you out of a lot of fuzzy, not so good eschatology that's out there today.
Yeah, and bro, there is a lot of that going on right now, and with the prominence of people who claim to be critical thinkers and the representations that they make that are completely void of anything that's critical or thinking, we have to be very serious about these things. It's amazing right now how we're looking at very mainstream people like Tucker Carlson or John Rich, who recently is promoting his Revelation song, or Candace Owens for that matter. They're beginning to justify the anti-Semitic positions that they hold based on what is, in essence, a completely unbiblical explanation of the renderings of these cities being named, and it's becoming a very destructive process. And the problem is the objectivity that we have to have when we go through the scriptures, and the consistency that we should be holding to is in essence removed. And when it gets removed, then it becomes subjective, and in its what we would call functional subjectivity, that's the term that I like to throw out. It's a very sarcastic term, obviously. You begin to see this strange set of ideals that are being put into place that cause these erroneous conclusions to happen. And right now we're beginning to see that. And it's just absolutely terrible. Where do you think is the next, where do you think this goes next in the immediate moment that we're in, bro? What do you think happens?
Well, I think the evangelical church, according to prophecies related to Christianity or Christendom in the last days, continues to grow increasingly apostate.
Yep.
Voices like ours that are arguing for a literal approach to the whole Bible will get fewer and fewer, drowned out, and actually hated. I mean, we're going to start being hated just for articulating some of the things that we're articulating. So the evangelical church, in terms of prophecy and its understanding, is going to grow increasingly blurry, and dark. Right. But as if that stops God's program. I mean, our lack of understanding of God's program doesn't stop God's program. And what you're going to see in the headlines is more and more prominence related to not just Israel, not just Jerusalem, but the Temple Mount.
Yeah.
And as that is simultaneously unfolding, you're going to see more and more in the headlines about not just Baghdad, not just Iraq, but the city, 58 miles south of Baghdad, if I've got my map right, the city of Babylon becoming more and more prominent in the last days. And That's so right. Expect more confusion from the professing church, but more crystallization in world events, because God can't lie. He means what he says and says what he means.
Yeah, and I just think about this more and more and more and more. And when you even read of the Ezekiel 38 account, which based on what I read in Ezekiel 39 would seem to imply that this would happen after the tribulation, or not the tribulation, after the rapture, correction there. And I know there's a lot of disagreement regarding that. I don't know who teaches what on what side, but just based on what God says in terms of him dealing directly with Israel, I'm under the impression that Ezekiel 38 happens, after the church is taken up. But the one thing that is interesting in all of that is, if that's true and we see a regional attack by a conglomerate of nations that gets put into effect as a result of what we know is going to happen, then I would argue that that makes Iraq even more substantial, especially considering the fact that Iraq isn't really a significant part of the discussion that we have with Ezekiel 38, just like Egypt isn't, and just like Syria isn't. Syria, there's a whole different take on why that's the case. But when I think about Egypt specifically, and even Jordan, for that matter, there's a lot of commonalities that exist with respect to the significance of the trade mechanisms that Saudi Arabia wants to deploy. So it all makes sense. Like I mean, even if you were to just try to common sense it out, you were just going to analyze it, and you have no knowledge of the Bible, Southern Iraq still makes the most sense. I don't know. What do you think about that? I mean, I just there's no other way I can think about it. Like, I try to find a different way out of that, but I can't see it.
Well, sometimes critics of the view that of Babylon being, literal in the future, people have said to me, well, how come Babylonia is not one of the invaders then in Ezekiel 38 and 39, which she isn't. There's about 9 countries named there, and Babylonia, the Hebrews called it the land of Shinar. The Greeks called it Mesopotamia, Meso between Potamia rivers, between the Euphrates and the Tigris, modern-day Iraq, where, by the way, the Tower Babel once stood. Yeah. People say, well, how come Babylonia is not one of the invaders in Ezekiel 38 and 39? And my answer is, well, that actually solidifies my argument. Yes. Because I think it's the Antichrist setting up shop there, so to speak, using the city of Babylon as his headquarters. That's where he is going to orchestrate the invasion. So the reason Babylonia or Babylon is not one of the invaders is because that's the headquarters where the Antichrist is telling everybody else to invade Israel. Yep. So in a certain sense, I see the absence of Shinar or Babylonia or Mesopotamia in Ezekiel 38 and 39 is actually further proof that Revelation 17 and 18 needs to be understood literally.
Listen, bro, I could not agree with you more. I think you're right. And I think that more importantly, to stop for a moment and to contemplate the significance of what you just said really does help to understand the geography of that time that we're talking about and the way that the theater is actually being set. The stage is being set. We're seeing it. It's really interesting. All right, bro. So believe it or not, we are completely out of time. We have a lot, and when I say a lot, I mean a lot that we went over today. Very, very valuable stuff. Put a cap on it for us, bro. Give us the final words. It's been insightful. I love talking to you guys. If you don't know this, by the way, Andy is by far the subject matter expert on the Babylon discussion. And he has some great resources that are available. I would highly recommend you take advantage of. You need to go to his YouTube channel. If you have not gone there, he's got great stuff there, and his website is fantastic. So, Andy, maybe as you close off, give us some final words. You can also tell us a little bit about those resources that people can take advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, my stuff, you can find it at Andy Woods Ministries. Just type that into your YouTube search engine. We're also on Rumble. You can find Andy Woods Ministries in terms of a website, and we have you go to the App Store, download our free app, Andy Woods Ministries in the App Store. Our shows are available on podcast format. Just go to wherever it is you get your podcasts, put in Andy Woods Ministries, and then I would also encourage you to take a look at Sugarland Bible Church, SLBC.org, stands for Sugarland Bible Church, where you can get archives of all of the sermon series, that we teach. And so there are many, many places to get all of our information, and all of those sites that I gave you are pretty comprehensive. So our stuff is there if people are interested in it. In terms of just sort of wrapping things up, I'm reminded of what, Jesus said in Matthew 16, towards the beginning of the chapter. He basically rebuked the Pharisees and the Sadducees because they understood weather patterns, red sky in the morning, sailor take warning, but they did not understand the signs of the times. They didn't understand the messianic moment that we're living in. And I believe that there's actually more signs for the second coming than the first coming. And
Amen.
We're literally living in, I think, what Chuck Missler called the times of the signs. where all of this stage setting is happening. And I would encourage people to give themselves to that area of thought, because the Lord was very disappointed that his leadership back in the first century, Israeli leadership, wasn't looking into it. And so many Christians are involved in everything else other than looking at the signs of the times. They're involved in social justice causes or whatever, but boy, get into the signs of the times and then realize that we're living on borrowed time. That's what all of this information will lead you to conclude, which leads to, boy, if I'm living on borrowed time, my most important commodity is time itself. And so I better be investing it properly into lasting resources. And there's only two: the souls of people and the word of God. Those are the only things that are going to make it from this life into the next. So really challenging God's people out there, to live for eternal things.
Amen. Man, that's great. It's great insight. I have literally nothing to add to that. That's a great way to button this up. Really, really good insight. Folks, we do sincerely hope that you've enjoyed watching this and listening to it as much as we've enjoyed making it. On behalf of the great Andy Woods, this is James Kaddis. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Countdown to Eternity. We love you guys so much, and we don't take it for granted that you take us along on your jogs, that you bring us into your living rooms, your workplaces. It's such a blessing. May God richly bless you. Seek him, because Christ could come at any moment. We love you. God bless you.